Our last speaker of the day is our Minister of Commerce and Consumer Affairs, Honourable Paul Goldsmith. For locals, he needs no introduction. And for our visitors, Paul has been a big supporter of this area, big supporter of the Commission, and has worked long and hard on issues around consumer credit, the CCCFA, which is our local legislation, and is working with various teams and steering groups on reviewing the Financial Advisors Act. So an extraordinary amount of work underway in this local market that is relevant to all of this room. Without further ado, Paul, because I know you've come up on a plane and you've got to get back to a plane, so thank you very much for taking the time to come. I'll invite you to come to the stage.
Well, thank you, Diane, and good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to, on behalf of the government anyway, welcome delegates to New Zealand. I hope you have a great time in the conference and get to enjoy some of the city and the country and what we believe is one of the great places on the earth to live. And thank you for coming all this way. I know that it's quite a long trip to get to New Zealand. And I want to acknowledge you all, and but particularly to give thanks to Retirement Commissioner Diane Maxwell for being a constant advocate for improving the money skills of New Zealanders. And so it's great to be here. I mean, one of the key considerations that you've been talking about today, echoed in the title of the conference, is how we as governments can encourage our citizens to give real consideration now to their retirement when it seems so far away, and what measures we can put in place to encourage people to consider the trade-offs between $1 today versus $1 tomorrow. And I know you spend all your lives dealing with these issues, but I think it is important, and the question just in the last session asked it, but it's important to acknowledge and understand the historical settings in New Zealand. So, we do in this country have a universal superannuation scheme provided to all New Zealanders on retirement, and we've had that for many decades, aside from a brief period of means testing in the 1990s, which we abandoned. And it's currently set at 66% of the net average wage for a married couple from the age of 65. And in contrast to the situation in many developed countries, it is affordable. We currently spend about 5% of GDP on it, and our Treasury predictions are that the cost will rise to about 7% of GDP in 2045. That is an increase, but it's one that we will be able to manage so long as we continue to keep control of other government spending. And so it's a system that fundamentally works well, and as a result, New Zealand has very low levels of poverty amongst its older citizens. But not surprisingly, such a system has an impact on our savings culture. With such a secure, universal system in place, individually we've been more modest in our retirement savings in the individual sense. And many people have looked to own a home, mortgage-free by retirement, and aim to live off their government superannuation, and that's been a long paved tradition. But with a slow trend over many decades of falling home ownership, the challenge that we have, I think, is to remind people that even with universal superannuation, there's every reason for people to save in order to have more choices in retirement. And that's the challenge for us, and that's why, as with so many nations represented here, the New Zealand government's recognised the significance of improving levels of financial capability, and we've invested considerable resources to achieve it. In July last year, I released a government statement on building financial capability in New Zealand. The statement was the first of its kind in New Zealand, confirming our commitment to building financial capability across the nation. And it signalled an introduction of an all-of-government approach to financial capability, which aims to build the skills of the public and to foster more engagement between New Zealanders and retirement savings. greater awareness of that will improve outcomes. And in my opinion, there are three main things that government can do. First, we can invest in research and education to promote and improve levels of financial capability. Second, we should implement appropriate settings to encourage retirement planning. And the well-established scheme like our own KiwiSaver helps over time to change savings behaviour. And finally, government needs to help get the regulatory settings right to build trust in the conduct of financial markets through its regulation. And this last aspect around building trust in financial markets has been one of my key priorities over the last couple of years. And the legislation changes that we've seen have been very substantial, and they have brought extra costs. We had to make improvements in the area, and now being ranked first out of 138 economies in the recent Global Competitiveness Index for Financial Markets Development was a testament to all the hard work that went in. And I'm optimistic we're on the right track there, but it will take some time to continue to improve the general confidence that New Zealanders have in the conduct of financial markets. And more participation in financial markets for companies to grow and raise capital provides more options for consumers and retirement fund managers. Now, for most New Zealanders, their point of contact with financial markets is KiwiSaver. And so I'll tell you a bit more about that. We're a country of 4.5 million, around 2.6 million have invested in KiwiSaver, about 34 billion in funds currently and growing considerably. It's the 10th birthday that we've had this year. And the purpose, as I see it, is to help Kiwis save, not to replace universal superannuation, which, as I said, works well in New Zealand, but to... and there are a few aspects of the KiwiSaver scheme that helped its success. While the scheme's voluntary, and you have the automatic enrolment that I've heard you talking about, employers must make contributions for eligible investors. Members receive tax credits tied to their annual contribution, and they can use the fund in order to purchase a first home, encouraging members to get into the habit of saving for retirement. The main challenge so far has been actually to engage New Zealanders in regularly thinking about their investment. What we hope to avoid is generations of New Zealanders retiring, having not thought about their KiwiSaver for 30 years and discovering that they've been in an inappropriate fund and have paid excessive fees, so that the result of their savings is less than it otherwise might have been. And so one area that we've been committed to make improvements is around transparency. So it was quite timely. Last week I announced our determination to make it easier for the public to engage with their KiwiSaver annual statement. In my view, providers should be upfront about their fees, that the current status quo has not been good enough around disclosure. And it's important to point out that providers don't need to wait for regulation to provide consumers with better information. Some already do it, and I expect everybody else should, certainly in time for the next year's statement. And it's important because once people know what they're dealing with, they're better informed to make proper decisions. So the proposed changes that we're considering are greater transparency around fees, including dollar values, projections for a lump sum and the resulting annual income that they're on track to achieve, more information about the investors, how the investors' savings are growing, and also prompts for investors to consider their fund choice and contribution rates, and information about how they can increase their retirement income. Look, as I mentioned earlier, I just wanted to touch briefly on Fintech and financial advice. We've got a review of our financial advisors regime underway that's been working its way through the system over a couple of years. I've seen in these couple of days you've been talking about Fintech development on our shores and overseas. And our reforms of the regulation of financial advice in New Zealand will enable financial advice to be provided through online channels, commonly referred to as robo-advice. Until now, our regulatory settings have prohibited this, limiting the access of financial advice to a relatively small group of consumers. Because I think regulations obviously do need to be responsive to what people actually want. And a lot of people, especially younger people, don't want a half-hour conversation about their financial planning. They want an app, and they want to be able to do it fast. And so regulatory systems have to be able to respond to what people want. And we're also considered a world leader. We introduced a tailored regulatory regime for equity crowdfunding and peer-to-peer lending. And we've got 5 peer-to-peer lenders operating now. And we're very determined to ensure that consumers in New Zealand are not left behind in a worldwide digital disruption age. And I'm working carefully to ensure that our regulatory settings enable innovation. So that gives you a bit of a sense of what we're doing. But look, I just wanted to wish you all the very best for this conference. Thank you for coming all the way to New Zealand, and certainly our government will be watching very closely and reading and considering some of the statements and papers that have been delivered over the course of these 2 days. And I'm just very conscious of the important work that all of you are doing collectively, that there's no greater challenge for many societies than to enable a measure of financial security for our citizens in their older age. And that's a very important area to be working on. And so all strength to your bow. And thank you very much for coming and the opportunity to say a few words. Thank you.